So this is 20.2 part 2. 20.1 is or 2 20.1 is really long, and 20.2 is also quite long, so I thought I'd split them up in two so that you guys didn't have to watch me on video quite as much. Although I am really good looking and I have great hair, so it's probably not that hard to watch me on video. So what was it like in Europe for the American forces? President Eisenhower was in command. He wasn't president at the time. He was just Dwight D. Eisenhower. They called him Ike. He was the military commander of all the Americans, and he actually worked under the British and French commanders. Our headquarters was in London, and 15 million men joined the armed services during this time. The United States and Great Britain stopped the Germans from advancing on the Middle East for Europe. Germany ran out of gas, and that is why they couldn't fight any longer in Africa. Germany was moving through the northern part of Africa from the west to the east to try to get to the Suez Canal. If they could have seized the Suez Canal, they could have controlled it and made their way to the Arabian Peninsula and basically taken all the gas that they wanted and probably won the war with it. But they ran out of gas before they got there. And now, in 1942, 300,000 U.S. troops just went ahead and went straight to Morocco and Algeria, which are in northern Africa, started up Operation Torch, and smashed, with the help of the Brits and the French, smashed General Rommel and forced a surrender in 1943. And I think they put Rommel to death because of it, or he committed suicide, one way or the other, although he was a great military leader, even though he was a Nazi. In Italy, the Germans were under General Patton, who was one of the great military leaders in the history of the United States. Although he was a little bit of a bad temper, so he wasn't able to lead all the forces of the all the American forces. They kind of kept him out of certain parts of the war. Patton went to Italy with the 7th Army in July of 1943, and the Italians by that time had already overthrown Mussolini. They'd gotten fed up with him. They killed him. I think they beat him, hung him, burned him, tortured him, and left him to rot because he had joined the war for the wrong reasons and with the wrong allies. The Italians welcomed the United States Army as liberators, and they went on to fight hard for the rest of the war, and they liberated Rome by 1944. The war in the Pacific was not as successful at the beginning. Japan fought hard and overtook the military outpost of Guam, and then they went and forced a surrender in the Philippines. General MacArthur was in charge of the Philippines, and he promised, "I shall return. I shall return." And was forced to leave some men fighting there at Bataan and Corregidor Islands in the Philippines. The Germans took them as prisoners and forced a terrible long march to prison camps that became known as the Bataan Death March. Any soldier, American or Filipino soldier that was too weak or diseased or wounded or hungry or tired was shot or killed with a bayonet. The ones that made it to Bataan and Corregidor, to the prison camps, faced torture for the rest of the war. It was very terrible, and they were eventually, liberated by the American armies. But there are some movies that show the cruelty of German, or excuse me, of Japanese prison camps, and they are hard to watch. Um, we just couldn't stand up to the might of the Japanese Navy and their tactics at the beginning of the war. They were spread out, or they were close around Japan, and they were just too strong for us to break through. We were losing battles. Japan was winning in the Pacific, and then in April of 1942, the USS Hornet which was an aircraft carrier, took several bombers, got them within 600 miles of Japan, and they went on a raid led by a man named Jimmy Doolittle, on April 18th, 1942, and 16 bombers under Doolittle raided and flew over Japan and bombed factories and oil refineries, and then landed back in China because they couldn't make it back to the Hornet with as much fuel as they had. So could it have been a suicide run? Very much so, if they landed in a hostile part of China. But this scared the Japanese into spreading out their ships, and we were able to fight them much, much more effectively after the Doolittle raid. This was a turning point in the war against the Japanese. And now that they're spread out across the Pacific, we just found ways to defeat them. In May of 1942, we fought the Battle of the Coral Sea. And it was an entire battle fought not by ships, but by airplanes that had launched from aircraft carriers. Then we fought the Battle of Midway. This was the turning point in the Pacific, and Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, and that's a massive loss for Japan. The Battle of Midway. They just made a movie about it. I haven't got to see it yet. I'm pretty excited to see that movie. Trevor said it's good, and I guess I trust Trevor. General MacArthur returned to the Philippines in 1944, in October of 1944, and joined with the Filipino freedom fighters and fought in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, or Leyte Gulf, where the Japanese fleet was destroyed and kicked out of the Philippines also. Japan, again, like Germany, ran out of oil. And then America started, the American fleet and military, the Navy, started a campaign called island hopping, where they would occupy. You see, of course, the South Pacific is full of tiny islands. So they would occupy one island, use it as a base to invade the next island. And when they conquered that next island, then they would use that island as a base to conquer the next island and just hop from island to island. But the fighting was difficult. The Japanese soldiers were rooted in. They weren't going to take any garbage from anybody. And they tunneled into these places, and many, many, many men died because of these battles. We fought in the islands of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and it just never stopped. One neat part of the war was the Navajo Code Talkers. If you've never heard about this, there's a great Nicolas Cage movie about it. The Navajo Indians of America had a unique language that Germany didn't know. That was unique, that it couldn't be translated unless you had, somebody that knew Navajo that could explain it to you, because it had completely unique basis in their own grammar, their own pronunciation. Their word for car didn't sound like car. Their word for tank, they didn't have one, but they used the word that they had for turtle, for tank, and found ways to talk so that we could go openly over the radio waves without being intercepted, because the Germans didn't know what the heck we're saying, which I thought was a pretty cool thing. And we'll talk more about the war tomorrow.